afternoon. Thank you very much. I'm Tim Fuchs with the National Council on Independent Living here in Washington, D.C., and I want to welcome you all back to Part 2 of the ABCs of Nursing Home Transition. I just want to remind you all that today's presentation is part of a series of trainings and other activities provided to the IL field by the new Community Opportunity Center at ILRU. The project's purpose is to assist centers in developing self-sustaining programs that support community alternatives to institutionalization for individuals of any age and youth transition from school to post-secondary education, employment, and community living. And the project is run by ILRU with partners at Utah State University's Center for Persons with Disabilities, the National Council on Independent Living, Suzanne Crisp, the Association of Programs for Rural Independent Living, and Michelle Martin. Okay, I'm happy to be back with you all for Part 2, and I want to reintroduce our speaker for the series, Bruce Donnelly. And I think you all know Bruce. So Bruce, you want to go ahead?
Sure, great. We're starting on slide 4. And on the last webinar, we gave an introduction and covered some of the more general aspects of transition. With this session, we're going to actually look at the assessment process and some of the initial interview to actually start getting into the direct work here. So once you've identified someone, the first step is assessment. This is a critical component in the process. And in assessment, we work with the individual, I want to emphasize that, with the individual, to identify what is needed for successful transition to the community. Moving on to slide 5, I'm going to start talking about how to conduct an assessment by what not to do. I think it's important to point out that when we're doing the assessment process, it's best not to do this as if you're going through a checklist. You should not seem like you're interrogating the person or that you're playing 20 questions. Ideally, where you go is you have the ability to do this in a casual, conversational manner. Now, in one day, when you're doing this, it actually won't even seem like you're performing an assessment because to the individual it will seem like it's a conversation. So if you're first doing this, you're probably nervous and thinking, oh my God, I need a checklist. And it is 20 questions. I'm not exactly sure what I'm doing. In this case, you might be worried that you're going to forget something. In this case, what I would recommend you do is a little bit of helpful and useful self-disclosure. If you're a little anxious, you want to look at your list to make sure you've covered something, just indicate that that's what you're doing. You have a list and you're checking down. Don't feel like you have to go through things, though, one right after the other and sort of question 48 is. It really is an interactive process where you're actually building a rapport with the individual. Moving on to slide 6. Having said that you don't actually need, you shouldn't be going through a checklist. There we are. There are a bunch of things that we're going to have to go over. We're going to look at the components here. Health services, including personal assistance services, is a major part of this. What mental health or addiction services the individual needs, the social supports, housing, critical. You can't get your attendance services under a bridge, so we have to work on housing. Transportation, volunteering and employment, advocacy, and financial resources. Now, this is not in order of importance. This is because each and every piece or component of transition plan is incredibly important and a part of the whole. So basically, if you think about it, if you don't have the money to pay for anything, you're stuck. So that's at the bottom of the list. They are all absolutely important. So what we're going to do is go through each of them in a little more detail to help you get a feel for what we're looking at. Okay, on slide 7, we're going to start with health services. And health services, let's just start with the very basic. What health services does the person need? There's some obvious things. Doctor, dentist, medications. You're going to need a community doctor. Sometimes the person has a doctor who's in the facility, so you're going to want to get a sense, determine whether or not there's any specialty doctors that are going to be needed. Medications, knowing the medications the individual is on can help you make sure that you have those at transition. It also raises some questions about whether the individual may need some support in that. So on slide 8, the question is, does the individual require services or support related to health conditions? Now, I think a great example, I like to use this for a couple of reasons, is diabetes. I myself have diabetes, and it's a really common thing that you're going to find. The diabetics are going to take over the world. So what you do is you need to sort of have a plan for addressing some of these things. How are the person's needs being managed? How could they be managed? And I think that what I like about this example is there are lots of different answers to how things could be managed. It is a balancing act. So when you get into the developing of the plan, you'll begin to do this. But I think at the point of assessment, you want to consider, what are the alternatives and options here? What is it that the individual needs? What are the individual's priorities? So I can tell you, for myself, a little bit of self-disclosure here. I was being treated for diabetes. I had my medications, but they had, shall we say, an explosive side effect. It was completely unacceptable to me, and that resulted in me being non-compliant with my meds and all sorts of bad health outcomes. So after a little letter from the doctor that said, continue at your own risk and it's not my fault, we had a heart-to-heart conversation, and I set down the situation and I said, look, here's the deal. I handcuff myself to fences. I am on airplanes. This is not acceptable. It doesn't work for me. So we then started to look at what alternatives there might be and talked through some of the potential consequences of alternative forms of treatment and changes in medication. I share this story because there are lots of different medications out there. There are lots of different approaches. With diabetes in particular, you can have the gold standard is a tight control on your blood sugar. That doesn't always work, and it's going to become an issue, particularly in transition. So getting a feel from the individual, how do they want to manage their medical issues as well, it's going to make a big difference, because you may actually go in a direction where a little bit, like in the case of diabetes, a little bit of looser control around the medications will result in more control and more independence in their life. So as we move into slide 9, you can argue that personal assistance services are not medical in nature, and I am completely in agreement with that. But we tie them together because personal assistance services often are provided through the medical system, and there is some crossover, like in the last example with the diabetes. So when we're looking at personal assistance services, the first question we need to ask and consider is, what type of personal assistance services does the individual need? What's the type of assistance? What's the frequency or intensity? And what's the purpose? What does the person need those services for? Getting the answers to those questions allows planners to structure a specific service to meet the individual's needs in the most integrated setting. It's important when we're doing this that we treat this in a setting-neutral manner. So I think one of the common things that people will say is, I need assisted living. Assisted living isn't a service. It's essentially a place, and it's a package of services. What I like to do is work with the individual to break down what it is that they actually need, because there's a lot of misconceptions about what assisted living does, what it can do. For a lot of folks, it means I want out of here and more control of my life. Other people feel that they need to have some kind of support at hand. They may not have a clear sense of what that is. Walking them through the process and figuring exactly what are the types of supports and assistance you need. So break it down piece by piece. And when you start to work with the individual to identify, well, I need help getting up in the morning, I need help getting in bed at night, and I need these kinds of assistance at meal time or intermittent during the day, you break that down and you can see exactly what you need to fill in. So moving on to slide 10, other supports that a person might need relate to mental health or addiction services. So does the person require some services and supports to deal with a psychiatric disability or addiction? What are those? Supports could include peer counseling, crisis intervention, medication assistance, a 12-step program, counseling. I think it's important to point out that sometimes when we're doing nursing facility transition, that some of these mental health needs and supports that are needed are situational. So if you think about living in a nursing facility, lots of folks are on receiving medication because they're depressed. My husband, does services and counseling with folks in nursing facilities. And, the staff at one point said, well, John's depressed. We need you to fix that. And his response was, the best way you could fix this is help him get out because he's depressed because he's here. So not necessarily what they were looking for, but it was actually the truth. So we need to acknowledge that sometimes these needs are situational, and you may not necessarily have to put that into the transition plan. It's a balancing act, or it may phase out of a transition plan. Folks may be hesitant to disclose this information, and this is a point that I'm going to reiterate probably several times. A lot of times people are fearful that if they share that information, that they're going to be excluded from nursing facility transition and getting out, that you're going to screen them out of the process. So I think it's important to build that rapport and be upfront about the fact that this is, that people may be hesitant and that there's room for this, that you give them the opportunity to disclose this. As we move on to slide 11, we're looking at social supports. So one of the things that people think about is you're not moving from the institution into a mini institution. You're moving from the institution to a life. So it's helpful to identify what social activities that the individual values. Let's look at what religious events or participation is important to them. What sort of recreational activities or social clubs are there? Are they involved with their family? Are there traditional family things that they do? Do they like to go visit? Are they people who like to visit the family on the holidays, or are they a closer-knit family who like to do things together? Leisure time preferences. What is it that they like to do personally? Now, these are not only just things that you're trying to help the person identify that can be built into the transition plan. Some of these things that they're interested in can turn into resources as well. So when you ask a person who used to be involved in your life, and you can identify some of those connections that were there, some of the people that they were involved with may be very interested in helping them transition back into the community. They have a personal investment and connection to this individual. They might actually be able to do some things to make a difference. Perhaps, for example, we have some women in our center who do knitting and sewing and such. They've been willing to adapt clothes to make things easier for folks, putting Velcro on or changing how zippers and things out. We've had people with knitting guilds and those kinds of things. There's a lot of resources out there in a person's own individual life. How can we leverage those, and how can we get the person back into doing the things that they like to do, the things that make their life, exciting and things that they want to do, worth living. Moving on to slide 12. As I said, you can't get your attendance services under a bridge. So we want to ask the person, where they want to live. And there are a lot of questions embedded in this. What's the location? What are their accessibility needs? And what are their size and space requirements? The assessment should consider their financial resources. Okay, so I would love to live, in this affluent neighborhood, but I have SSI. Chances are that is not necessarily going to happen, so you need to consider what the person can afford when you're looking at these options. And I encourage folks to think about housing not linked to services. So when we're talking about, I want to move into that assisted living facility. Okay, what you're talking about then is, a solution that covers everything. It may be the solution, but what is it that your housing needs are? How much space do you need? What's the affordability? In some cases, assisted living isn't affordable. So let's break that down and separate out what are the personal assistance needs you have, what are the housing needs. So it's important when you're looking at housing to review the options with the individual and consider all of the options and put them on the table. So help the individual think a little more globally about what they're looking at. For example, one of the things that we like to make sure is put on the table is that you're not limited by geography. We have helped people transition from actually one part of the state to another. I know folks around the country who have actually helped people transition from one state into another. And that's, I think, important because there may be service options that are available in another state. Make family there. Open it up. It's not necessarily coming out the door of this facility in this community and moving into an apartment right here. I also think it's important to recognize that when we're trying to identify housing, that the individual is starting over. So they may not have, they may have come from a very nice home in the suburbs, but now they have nothing. They're poor like, a lot of folks with disabilities. So they are in the process of starting over. And you may need, as you're going through the assessment process, to acknowledge that. I also think it's important for us to make sure when we're doing the assessment that we're not imposing our values on someone else. So, for example, I've had people say, I would never move someone into that neighborhood. That's a value that you're placing on the neighborhood. It may actually be that that person had lived in that neighborhood and that's where they would be comfortable. And honestly, we're not moving them anywhere. They're moving, we're assisting. So when we're doing the assessment, it's important to keep in mind that, our values can color what we're looking at and to make sure that we're letting the person drive the process and not impose our values on them. Transportation on slide 13. All right, I love to talk about transportation because earlier on when I first started doing this, I have to say my own experience limited what I was thinking about. And there are some things that you want to consider. I was talking about what's the availability of public transportation? What's the availability of paratransit? Are those services available? Is there private transportation? And then someone from Alaska pulled me up by the ear, or maybe the short hairs on the back of my neck, and said, well, here we're more concerned about things like roads. And I thought to myself, wow, how, focused I was on what my community and my experience was that opened up a whole range of other issues. And clearly it's going to be very different. Transportation is one of those things that's going to vary wildly from place to place. So I think here you're wanting to look specifically in terms of assessment, where does the person go or need to go on a regular basis, an intermittent basis? What types of transportation options are there? A lot of, particularly Centers for Independent Living are very familiar. We have people with disabilities who are living in the community. We know what transportation options are out there. We also know the effectiveness of them and which ones really work and which ones not so much. Are there any specialized transportation needs that the individual has? Is there something specific that we need to take into consideration with the plan? And then looking at potentially distinctions between, say, medical transport kind of needs, emergency transport kind of needs, and then those day-to-day things. We want to make sure that we've covered all of those bases. Moving on to slide 14. The question of volunteering, education, and employment is a great question that should come up during the assessment process. So what is the individual going to do after transition to the community? Are they interested in volunteering, pursuing education, working? What I like about this part of the assessment process, and this can actually be a really fun conversation, is it gets the person to think about their future life. We're not just talking about leaving this nursing facility. We're talking about moving into our new life. So I have to say, My example has always been the same on this, and I now have a much different perspective having gone through the process myself. I would always say this is like planning for your marriage and not the wedding. I think until recently I did not actually fully understand exactly how many details there were in a wedding. It is probably almost as complicated as a transition. So any of you who are out there who have survived marriage or wedding can probably do transition. The process, though, is that people sometimes get a little focused on the event and fail to consider what life is like after that. I think it's important during the assessment process that we're not just looking to how do we make this one day happen, what is it that the individual is looking for beyond that. On slide 15, we look at the referral to the state vocational rehab office. That may be really important here. You know, if a person's interested in that phase of their life and being able to do that. But there are those who you may bring the conversation up. You may get some very useful information that's helpful in the assessment process, but it's clear that they're not ready to have that conversation. Don't worry if this is not something that they're immediately thinking about. Education, work, volunteering, maybe it's a little much for them at this point because they can't conceptualize what their life is like out in the community. Our experience has been we make sure that that's a discussion that happens during the assessment process. It's very helpful in getting information. It's helpful in developing a plan, but sometimes a person isn't ready to actually move forward with that. They're a little more focused on the shorter term and a little more anxious about that. That's okay. Work with the person, let them drive the process, but help the person identify things that they enjoy outside the home, potentially coming to your center, being involved in social groups, that type of thing. Slide 16 talks about advocacy. This particular piece of the assessment process should not be underestimated. The importance is it's extraordinarily important that we assess the individual's comfort in advocating for him or herself. So as you're working with the individual, are they timid? Are they expressing their needs and desires? Are they very free with that? There are those of us out there who are very clear on what they want. Probably 85% of them live in New York City. There are those who are a little more timid and don't feel comfortable expressing their needs. What kind of support is needed to help the person if they need some support in their self-advocacy skills? The reason this is important is because when you're in the community, you are not that passive patient. You are actually in charge of your life. And your ability to advocate for yourself will affect your ability to manage attendance or attendance services through an agency, address how you interact with the healthcare system, and address, what happens in the event of an emergency. So your ability to advocate for yourself is extremely important. Looking at slide 17, we're going to look at the financial resources that an individual needs to have. We're looking for complete information about Social Security, SSI benefits, other income. Do they have Medicaid, Medicare? Do they have personal assets? Don't assume that an individual has any of these things or all of them. I think early in the process when we started to do assessments, we basically assumed everyone was connected with Social Security in some way, shape, or form. And then we were working with a woman who actually did not have, although she was in the nursing facility, she was eligible for Medicaid, she had not actually ever applied for Social Security or SSI benefits, even though she was eligible. Her financial needs were being met in another way. She had a settlement from a divorce. So it's important to work with people to help them identify whether they have these benefits and make sure that you walk through the process. In some places, there are Medicaid trusts. They come up. They have different names in different places. These are mechanisms where an individual has income placed in a trust that's not technically in their control, but it's for their benefit. often it's used as a way to connect the person up with Medicaid. So you want to check to see if that's something in place. I'll share, and I like to share a lot of the mistakes I made so that you don't have to go and make the same ones. You can go off and make different ones for yourself. We hadn't actually asked that question and worked very vigorously and actually held the state over a barrel and got them to pay for a whole lot of things to transition this young man out of a nursing facility. Only after we transitioned him out and the state had paid for a whole bunch of stuff did we find out that he had a trust with actually a relatively significant amount of money, and he could have paid for that. It would have actually been a lot simpler for him, smoother, and made more sense to have just gone that, the route where he could have had that paid for out of the trust. But, live and learn, and he got a little extra from the state. Now, when you're working with financial resources, I understand how intimidating some of this can be. I was one of these people who actually said I never wanted to learn the difference between Medicaid and Medicare. I didn't want to know the difference between SSI and SSD and Social Security and all of this. This was all foreign language to me that I didn't want to have anything to do with. And when you're new to the process, you might be a little intimidated. I have managed to learn a bit about all of these things. New staff who are coming into the transition process will as well. But sometimes it may be helpful if you're moving into an area where you're a little unclear and financial benefits and resources may be one, is to have an experienced staff person go with you. Or even just maybe an experienced staff person to be a mentor, to give you some suggestions to walk you through the process. No matter what happens, you're still at the assessment phase. I think the thing that you need to consider as you're going through this is you probably can't screw this up. The assessment phase is there's nothing is undoable at this point. It's simply a process of getting information and working with the individual. So what I'd like to do at this point is move to slide 18 and open it up to questions.
Good afternoon, Bruce. I apologize if you happened to go over this and I missed it, but when you were talking about the assessment part and you brought up crisis intervention, what exactly does that entail in terms of a crisis when we're working on transitioning somebody out? If I could just get better clarification, please.
Okay, sure. I mean, there are a lot of services that are out there, and crisis intervention can look a lot of different ways in different communities. I think one of the things that I think about in our community is we have a self-help drop-in center, which provides peer support after hours in the evening during non-business hours for folks who are having a mental health crisis. So if the person is really upset and they want to, they're thinking about killing themselves, they may not be making it, they have some experience with this. They know that they're moving in this direction. They can potentially go to this crisis drop-in center, get some peer support, and see whether that can be something that can be worked through in that manner rather than necessarily be taken off to the hospital. But, working with the individual, I think it's important to let the individual know that you're there to support them and that you want to put together a plan that's going to work for them. Now, sometimes within the field, there are more medical model approaches to crisis intervention. I don't know, we're just at this point in the assessment process trying to decide whether, work with the individual to determine whether there are needs in this area. So it's not necessarily something I would lead with. But if a person has, says they have a significant history where they have needed support on an, emergency basis, that's definitely something you want to consider when doing the assessment.
Okay.
Does that help?
Yes, sir.
Is this a program for both Medicare and Medicaid? And my next question is, do you need to be on just Medicaid to qualify for the transitioning out of assisted living or nursing homes? And does the transitional coordinator visit all assisted living homes and swing beds in hospitals and nursing homes to identify residents who would like to transition to the community?
All right. I'm going to start at the beginning. If I missed something in what you asked, please just bring me back around. I have a very limited little short-term memory thing and might lose something along the way. At first, I just want to say the transition, as we're talking about it, does not assume any type of eligibility for financial benefits as far as I'm concerned. You're going in with a blank slate.
Okay.
So people may be receiving services. The nursing facility stay may be paid for by Medicaid. Often it is, but it may not. And there are some cases where an individual may be on Medicaid in the nursing facility, but not actually eligible for community-based Medicaid. So you might be needing to look at different alternatives. So when we go in and we start the assessment process, we're just trying to start the process and figuring out what's actually going on with the individual, what is it that they need to transition, and then we start looking at what the funding streams are.
Okay.
Now, there may be some supports that are provided by Medicaid and or Medicare. So, that's very open. This is not necessarily paid for by either Medicaid or Medicare. Now, in some places, states have made Medicaid dollars available using various funding streams so that transition services can be folded into, say, a Medicaid waiver program where it gets paid for as part of what they call service coordination. So there's a way to pay for that, but for us, the transition process is outside of the Medicaid services process, and it's just we provide a neutral sort of process, a support that's not tied to any of those funding streams to help the individual figure out how to get from the nursing facility back to their life. Did I get all of those?
Who pays for it then if it's not on Medicaid or Medicare waivers?
Okay. The answer to that question is going to differ from center to center. One of the things that I've done is, in our center, we've leveraged dollars from other programs. So we have some fee-for-service Medicaid work that we do that has generated a surplus or a profit. We've put that back into our community and paid for transition services because we think it's important. So the staff are not directly paid for by Medicaid. It's surplus. Some places are using independent living funds. Other places, states have allocated money under Money Follows the Person or Real Choice Systems Change Grants or even state dollars to support people moving from institutions into the community. So there are a lot of different answers as to how this gets paid for, and they're going to vary from state to state. So if you're interested in moving in that direction, I'm happy to have a conversation offline. Where are you from?
Durango, Colorado.
Okay, so I'd be happy to chat with you a bit about potential options in Colorado for funding transition work. I know that there are folks out there who are doing this and can connect you up with them.
Thank you.
Okay, Bruce, questions are rolling in.
I have another question, though, that Bruce wants me to keep on task with. Assisted living facilities, nursing home facilities, and swing beds in hospitals that are in for long-term care.
Yes, thank you so much. As I said, short-term issues. I appreciate you compensating for that. Okay, we work with people in all the different levels.
Okay.
So we have supported people in transitioning out of assisted living into the community. We have supported people who are in nursing facilities, and we've had some folks who are just stuck in some sort of limbo in hospital beds in a hospital which were classed as long-term. We have worked with folks in all of those settings and probably a couple others. So the work, for us, it's sort of an evolution. So it depends on what where your program is in terms of its evolution. I wouldn't necessarily start with some of the more complex settings.
Okay.
So if you are just starting out,
yes,
using some, okay, then use some of the stuff that I talked about at the on the last webinar in terms of outreach. I think one of the things that I find really exciting and sometimes unnerving, even in my own center, we will inevitably find someone with the most complicated needs that you could possibly come up with, and that's where we want to start. Go team. I support my staff because honestly, they this is not something they consider. But when you're first starting out and you're wanting to get your feet wet, start simple, work your way into it. So I might start with a local nursing facility where you've had some rapport, or maybe where you can develop one, someone maybe who had been with your center who ended up going into a nursing facility where you may have some history. And then slowly what you'll find is you expand out from there.
Thank you. I appreciate your answers.
Oh, thank you
for doing this.
All right, Bruce, the questions are rolling in on the web. We'll get to...
We're good. Tim, I'm a little behind, so we're good.
Okay, well, good. Well, let's take the time then. Let's do these three, and then we'll get back to the presentation. And if you're on the phone and you didn't get to ask your question, if you're still in the queue, don't worry. Just remember it or write it down, and we'll take another Q&A break when we finish. Okay, so Bruce, the first of the web questions is from Katie Zortman, and she says she has a gentleman who wants to transition but has no plan to leave his home. I assume once he moves, he doesn't have any plan to get out in the community. So it says his goal is to smoke good cigarettes in his apartment and eat good food like Red Baron pizza by the slice. What would you say to that? Any advice?
Well, I think it's what every person values. On the last webinar, I talked about a woman who really she transitioned out of a nursing facility. She moved into her own apartment. She actually did the first week she was come out on an adapt action with us, and she said, "I can't believe last week I was in a nursing facility. This week I have a pair of handcuffs. I'm drinking a beer, and that guy across the lobby there is looking at me like I'm, Thanksgiving turkey." So she was really excited about that. There are different, she ended up, she was more of a bookish kind of person, and she wanted to stay in her apartment, read, and then she eventually wrote her own book. So, it's what the person values. I think a piece of it may be the social connections that they build. So during the transition process, as you move, you do some meetings at the center or maybe out in the community. As they meet other people who have transitioned, they may build some more things that, connections that can be a part of their life out in the community. And, one of the things that we talk about is, we do actually have pizza at our place on a not irregular basis. So, you don't necessarily have to eat your pizza in the apartment. You can actually come out to the center and hang out with folks. So I think making sure that that's on the table and offered. But if, I can't, and the issues around cigarettes, I understand, are extraordinarily complicated. They sometimes are underestimated as a tool in the rehab process. I know a lot of folks who learned to transfer because they needed and wanted a cigarette. I have a lot of mixed feelings on all of this, but I just know that that's there. So maybe, that is an important part of what he wants to be able to do. I think you have to value that.
Okay, thanks. So Billy Rich writes in, he is currently helping somebody with a transition out of a nursing home. And he says that, and excuse me, I'm paraphrasing here, he says that the transition team had a meeting yesterday, and the representative from Voc Rehab, their IL person, wouldn't let the IL specialist from their Center for Independent Living into the meeting, although that person had been requested by both the consumer and their family. So he's asking, what can you do in a situation like that where they desperately, they very much want to be involved, and the consumer and the person's family wants them to be involved, but they're running into problems with another agency with VR. Any tips?
Okay. This is one of those things where I would let the director of the center know that this is an issue and there needs to be a sit-down with the Voc Rehab people. At the meeting, you have it's really going to be driven by the individual. So if they say that you can't come in, it really is then a question as to whether or not the individual wants to continue with the meeting without you there. It may be helpful to consider, to think about why that's going on. Maybe that you've advocated for the individual and people in the system, for this individual or another. And people in the system don't like that, in which case, I would want you in the meeting even more if it were me. So, you want to sort of get a feel for that, but it really probably comes down to if the individual goes ahead with the meeting or the individual and their family go ahead with the meeting, getting debriefed on the meeting afterward. I would just sit there and wait, talk with the individual after the meeting, and then do a follow-up because they really don't have – it's inappropriate for them to exclude a service provider from a meeting like this.
Sure. Good. And then finally, Alexa from Arlington. Hi, Alexa. Says that, well, this is similar to Katie's question in a way, but it's a different nuance. So she says, have you ever dealt with someone with that has unrealistic expectations? And she says that she understands that imposing her values is a bad idea, but sometimes people may have unrealistic ideas about what's out there. Any tips for Alexa?
Right. I think that, and we're going to talk a little bit about some of the asking the hard questions and having how you deal with that. I think at this point, when someone's unrealistic about what's out in the community, I sort of have to decide whether they're unrealistic, whether I am unaware of resources. Let's take it back and break it down. What is it that you're looking for? So, there are some folks who may say, I need 24-hour nursing care in order to move out, and that's their answer when you say, what kind of assistance do you need? Then what I've typically done is sort of broke down, well, do you get 24-hour assistance here? Well, yes. So then I look in the room. There's no nurse here. I mean, I don't understand what you mean. I think and I always put that back on me. I think it's important to say, I'm not understanding, so it doesn't seem that I'm being attacking in a way, but just try to clarify. What exactly is it that, what does the nurse do for you? Explain, talk through some of the, how attendants can do some of those things, and share some of that. And there's some other strategies I think I'll be talking about during the second part of this webinar that might get to that. If it's not sufficiently answered by the end, please make sure we get back to this. But I think that there are some strategies to sort of get more specific during the assessment process about what the individual is looking for in terms of those details of assistance, as opposed to sort of getting into the global, well, this service is available or that isn't.
Great. Okay, so we're going to get back to the presentation, but before we do, I have a really quick announcement. A couple of people wrote to us in between the two calls and were asking about checklists. And we know that we don't want the assessment to be like a checklist, right, but it can be a really helpful tool for us as transition coordinators. So we actually have this full manual for this training because we've done this in a variety of venues before. We've done on-site trainings. So we're going to post a link now to that ABC's manual, the full manual that you can access online. There are a number of checklists on there for all throughout the process. So please check those out. If you're not on the webinar, if you're listening on the phone, you can email me at tim@ncil.org, and I'll respond with that same link so you can access it too when the call's over. So Bruce, thanks for taking all those, and let's get back to it.
Okay, moving on to slide 19, conducting the initial interview. So there's some things that we want to do at the very beginning of the process. First, introduce yourselves and get acquainted. Building a rapport is extraordinarily important, and that sort of social aspects of getting to know the person and them getting to know you is one of the first things you do. We like to explain our role as a nursing facility transition facilitator. For us, initially going in, as I said, I put exactly, 46 seconds, not even, of thought into developing this within our center. Just decided one day, I'm being pushed, we're doing it tomorrow. We didn't actually have up front clarified expectations of what do we or don't we do. But one of the things that we quickly learned was that folks had a lot of concerns about conditions within the facilities once they started to look at getting out. So we became really clear that if you have a concern, and we have a strong nursing facility ombudsman program in New York, so one of the things that we said was we're going to handle the stuff related to working with the transition. we can refer you to the Ombudsman program for things within the facility. So clarifying some of that up front, again, in a very sort of casual way, I like to point out that this allows us to spend all of our time working on the transition aspects to get people out sooner and to spend more time working on that as opposed to getting tangled up in things that other people can do. It's important, we think, to talk about the independent living philosophy. That gives people a sense in terms of that whole sort of building rapport and getting to know each other. When you start talking about things, I know that when independent living folks start talking about the philosophy, we are excited. So I think that that's something that you can share. It's something that they can hear about you, and it's important. I think, though, it's important when you're working with someone who may be older, that when we talk about the independent living philosophy, although a person may, use a wheelchair, have hearing aids, and not be able to see, 3 feet in front of them, they may not self-identify as a person with a disability. So one of the things that we do is tailor that conversation sometimes when we're talking with older folks and, say, seniors and people with disabilities. In this case, for us, the issue is sort of a competence issue, a cultural competence issue in terms of working with older folks, because you don't have to self-identify as a person with a disability to transition. And if this will make the conversation easier to relate to, hey, we'll just add a couple extra words. Educating the individual about the Olmstead decision and the rights of that is one of the things we also do up front. This is helpful, I think, in a couple of ways. First, it gives people a sense that you're not the typical service provider coming in because you're talking about their rights. That's a very different conversation than folks often have. It's also helpful in addressing the feelings that the person feels that they're to blame for being in the nursing facility. So when you talk about their right to live in the community and the fact that their rights may have been violated, that gives them a sense that this is something that they didn't do to themselves. It wasn't their fault. A lot of times people were told, because you can't transfer, you need to go to a nursing facility. Because you don't have family, it's all about the individual. What we're doing is saying, because the agency violated your rights, you're here, it gives the person a sense that they aren't responsible, it wasn't their fault, and it just sets the tone in a different direction. Moving on to slide 20. Is the initial interview, talk about trust and honesty. The nursing facility transition process involves a lot of both. Not only does the individual need to put some trust in you, you both need to be honest with each other. I think this is where we have the conversation about some of those expectations, how you address the fact that a person has expectations that might be beyond what can be done with the existing service systems. That's a conversation where you need to have some honesty. It's particularly important because if the individual doesn't share critical information up front and you don't have the whole story, it's important that you lose time in potentially supporting that person and moving into the most integrated setting. I think it's important when we're doing these conversations that we are clear that disclosing information doesn't cause problems for the transition. In fact, giving the information helps us. So in this case, I like to give examples, particularly if I have a feel for stuff that's going on. I know that there are some things that are typically problems and how people end up in the nursing facility. A lot of folks end up because they went to the hospital. Sometimes people have difficulty managing money. I think here a little bit of helpful self-disclosure is, good. I say that, one of the things that sometimes people are deeply concerned about sharing is that they've had difficulty managing their money, that they didn't pay their rent, and that it's going to be hard for them to get an apartment. I like to point out that debtor's prison doesn't exist anymore, that you don't lose all of your right to live in the community simply because you couldn't pay your bills. There are services and supports out there that can help fix this. And in fact, we have the tools that we can go around and do that. And I often point out, I'll actually show people, I usually often have like $4 in my pocket, and I say, clearly, If I can live out here with $4 in my pocket, you can too. Moving on to 21. As part of the initial interview, we want to obtain demographic information. Get the required reporting data. All right, now, age and disability type are going to help you determine in the planning process what services and supports the person's eligible for. Unfortunately, the system is fragmented based on diagnosis, age, geography, area of residence, any of a variety of things. So the service you need to know that information in order to connect people up with the appropriate services when you get into the planning process. So knowing what those services are and the kinds of questions that you need to ask will often drive the demographics for you. The other thing that's helpful is reporting data will make your manager happy. I just point this out because they're probably paying for this webinar. So return the favor. When it comes time for them to complete the federal reporting or whatever they have to do, having the demographic data will make them very happy and keep you off their radar. So you can put more energy into transitioning. So that's an important piece of this. Moving on to number 22. Get background information. Background information can help you identify potential barriers to the transition process. So again, someone may be reluctant to share information, but whether they've had difficulties with a home care agency, whether they were, in our community we've had folks who were blackballed from the home care agencies, whether they've had credit problems, these are all things that could cause problems in the transition process. Again, I talked a bit about sharing information and getting, reassuring folks that they should be able to do this with you, share the information, and it's not a problem, and in fact it's helpful. So I really want to reinforce that here. The other thing that we can do, and I think it actually came up in the chat, was ask the consumer how they ended up in the nursing facility. Now, the answer to that question can provide you a lot of insight into what needs to be put in place to help the person get back out. It's a simple question. It gives you a lot of information. It allows them to tell their story. And we came to this in a very different way because when we started our nursing facility transition work, we saw it as an advocacy activity. And we were working with folks in filing complaints with the Health and Human Services Office of Civil Rights. And by asking people how they ended up in the nursing facility, we were trying to build a case for how their civil rights under Olmstead had been violated by the state and, the local community. What we had not really considered was that was an excellent assessment process to work to develop the plan. So we came to it as advocates, but we found that it was a very useful tool. So I encourage folks, it's a simple question. It's a story that folks are very willing to tell, and it can give you a lot of helpful feedback. So moving on to slide 23, you're probably thinking, I can't do this all in one visit. You are absolutely right. If you were to try to do all of this in one visit, everyone would be exhausted, and probably like me, you would forget half of what actually happened. So what you want to do is work with the person and let them set the pace for the conversation. So you're going to, if the person seems tired and unresponsive and you have questions that you want to, you're throwing at them, really it's time to, call it a day and say, okay, let's move on. So really, and I don't think you should expect to be able to do this all in one sitting. It just isn't workable. So please take your time, work with the individual, feel fresh about it, and break it down into a couple of visits. On slide 24, we're going to look at some of the tough questions. I think one of the things that happens when we're doing transition is we do find sometimes people have, their expectations are a little off of what's available in the community. They just don't know. Why would they? Sometimes you need information that's really personal. I think it's important to recognize that you need to ask some direct questions. I like to make sure that I explain why I'm asking these questions. Now, often folks in facilities are used to people asking prying and annoying questions. I think that we want to set a different tone when we're working with folks. So one of the things that people are often very, or at least I'm anxious about asking is financial information. How much money do you make? How much money do you have in the bank? These are extraordinarily personal questions. But often for services and figuring out what an individual is eligible for, this is extraordinarily critical information. I like to point out why I'm asking the question. I often acknowledge up front I'm a little anxious. I'm anxious about asking. I don't want you to think that I'm being nosy. And this is why I need to know. People are always really forthcoming when you put that on the table and say, this is why I need to know this information. And that's particularly true for us here at our center because we have one of the Medicaid trusts, and we're trying to figure out the best advice we can give an individual, in terms of how they can manage their money and how they can get the most out of it. So these are tough questions. Acknowledging it and putting it on the table and then asking is the way to do that. Again, it comes down to giving the person reassurance. We work on sometimes people think, that I know everything that's going on in their life because I'm the director of my center. And, they'll say, oh, did you hear about this? And I'll say, no. And they say, well, why don't you know about that? I said, because we work on a need-to-know basis and I don't need to know. So reassure people that we work on a need-to-know basis, we maintain their confidentiality, and maintain that rapport with individuals. You get a lot more information from folks that's very useful. And often I find that sharing some food or a meal is a great way to build that rapport. It's how we work together. Slide 25. We're going to start to look at some of the common questions. Now, I talked about how did you end up in the nursing facility, but other things that you might ask, how long have you been here? That can give you some sense of when the person came in. If you're new to this, you won't necessarily know what things were like in terms of service delivery during a particular time frame. But it's helpful for me to know if you've been in this facility for 20 years, 10 years, or 3 months. How did you end up here? Similar to the other question, how you came in. How is your nursing facility stay being paid for? A person may not know the answer to that question, but it's a good question to ask to get a feel. Are you able to direct and manage your own assistants? I think one of the things that we like to put on the table during the assessment processes, particularly because we have the opportunity for self-direction of services, is to ask people, some of these questions around whether they are able to and interested in managing their own personal assistance services. I like to be clear that it's not required for transition. You don't have to be a CEO to transition out of a nursing facility. There are lots of options out there. Some people want to have more control over their services, so it's a good way to gauge that. And you can break it down and see for the individual and explain that, because it may be, that they want to be able to tell the individual, the attendant that's working with them, these are the things I want you to do, but they're not comfortable with scheduling, or they're concerned that they might have issues with scheduling. So some of that's a really good thing to get a sense of what kinds of supports and services do they need around their attendant services. Moving on to slide 26, we're going to continue some of these questions. Again, we had talked about what types of things do you need help with. Again, we're breaking this down. And we wouldn't say it like this. Activities of daily living. Do you need help transferring? Do you need help in the bathroom? Instrumental activities of daily living. The person already knows from having chatted with me that I may need some assistance in managing my money. And there's an informal support that can do that. But, what other kinds of supports does a person need? Do they need help with managing their money? Do they have difficulty with, maybe participating in the community? Do they need some kinds of supports? What is it that they need there? Health-related functions. Do they need assistance with, like a feeding tube or a trach or some other support that is considered more medical in nature? So again, we're just, you just sort of have a conversation, but you're really looking at all of those different pieces. And in the back of your head, you've got, or potentially, if you're new at this, when you go back to the office and you start looking at the lists and things, you start thinking about what options the individual is going to have. But again, we're just starting the assessment process to determine that. Another question, what types of things do you want assistance with? Now, sometimes people will they'll be very forthcoming about what they need assistance with, but they'll think, well, no one can assist me with, something like transportation, or no one would be able to assist me when going to church, so I'm not even going to put that on the table. So asking what the person wants assistance with gets you past their preconceptions about what's available for them that they need and gets you some additional information. Another good question is, if you were at home and you came into the nursing facility, were you happy with your services? And why were they terminated? I think this is a great question. Were you happy with your services puts the focus on the individual and allows them to talk about quality issues that might have been part of the reason they ended up back in the nursing facility. Why were your services terminated? People might say, well, I went to the hospital. So you know that there was a hospital stay that interrupted their services. Maybe they'll say that the home care agency withdrew services. So you can get a sense of how, again, it goes back to the same question, but it's a good way to get to that. Asking people, do you have a home? It seems like it's why would you ask that? They're in the nursing facility. We've actually worked with folks who are very smart at manipulating the systems and working their way through. And one woman actually had convinced her HUD landlord to base her rent on her allowance while in the nursing facility. I have absolutely no idea how she did this, but for like $4 a month or something, she maintained her apartment. Clearly, makes that made the transition simpler. But sometimes people have a home. They ended up in their nursing facility. Sadly, and this is where we'll talk a little bit more. You need to go to other places as well. Sometimes people think they have a home and don't. So we actually have had situations where individuals were under the impression that they had a home, but the family members just didn't tell them that it had been sold. So the starting point, though, is with the individual trying to sort through what options do we have. Is it accessible is a great question, but you still have to break it down because sometimes people don't necessarily know what that means, particularly if they weren't living with a disability before. So talking through, are there steps to get in and out of the house? Is there a bathroom on the first floor or a bedroom on the first floor? If the person has a home, that's a piece. The other thing you want to consider is whether the individual may be living with family. So in some cases, an individual will be leaving the nursing facility, not going into their own apartment, but want to live with family. So, and that may include an adult child and their family moving into their home. So again, these are all the kinds of questions that you'll need to ask in terms of accessibility. Moving on to slide 27. If the person's looking at an apartment, what area do you want to move into? We talked a bit about some of the issues around housing, but getting a sense of if they're from that community and they want to live there, where in the community do they want to be there? Why? I think that, people sometimes have strong, I want to live in this particular neighborhood because that's where I went to church. I'm very connected to that. So getting that can lead you and give you some important information. Are your family and friends supportive of you moving out? The answer to this question can give you some sense about the problems you may or may not run into and the kind of work you might need to do with family. And if they're not supportive, why? What does it, my daughter doesn't want me to leave the nursing facility because she's afraid I'll fall. That kind of information is really helpful when you get to the point where you're talking to the daughter. You have at least what the person thinks the daughter's thinking, so that might help you in developing some of your responses and dealing with the family. Similarly, what does the doctor say? In some cases, it may be the facility doctor. Maybe they may have a physician that they've worked with previously that they're connected to, so you want to look at that. But again, often when you're looking at Olmstead issues, the doctor is considered a treating professional. So I would argue that those of us doing transition should also be considered treating professionals, and that's held. But you do want to get a sense of where the doctor stands. Would you like to talk to someone who's been through the nursing facility transition process? As much as I can talk about this, and I think I talk about it pretty well, I have not gone through this. So there are some things about the transition process that I cannot, really connect with an individual on. But I know lots of people who have been through this process. They connect on a much deeper and immediate way on some of these issues. So asking the individual if they would like to talk to other folks does a few things. First off, it gives them the opportunity to connect with someone who's done it. It also reinforces for the individual that it's actually something that can happen. So it's not just, you would be surprised. Some of the folks that we worked to transition out of facilities didn't actually believe it was possible. They just said yes. And it indicated that they wanted to do this just to see if we were, talking out our butt. So this is really gives the person an opportunity to hear firsthand what it's like, and it begins to also build some social connections early in the process that you can, the person might take advantage of later. Moving on to slide 28, we're going to look at some of the tips for successful interviewing. And now some of these are going to seem obvious, but I have learned you need to say the obvious. Be on time. Now, although I am often late, I try very, very hard, and because I have no sense of what time it is, I try very, very hard to be on time. Being on time for appointments like this shows the individual that you respect them, that they're just not sitting, they're probably not going to go anywhere, but knowing that you are going to be on time and you're respectful of them sets the tone. You also, when you're setting up appointments, want to think about what's going on in the nursing facility. Setting an appointment up around a mealtime is not going to work, or setting up an appointment just before a mealtime or something that's going to happen that the person values means that you're going to have the appointment cut short. So think about that in terms of scheduling as well. Dress casually. I think going in and looking, super professional, like you're a lawyer or an investigator, doesn't necessarily send a message that you're connected to the individual. Now, when I say casually, it doesn't mean sloppy or dirty, and it means controversial. So I would not necessarily go in with a KISS T-shirt. No offense to those of you who love KISS, John Sorensen, but that might turn people off. But I typically wear a nondescript pair of Dockers and a button-down shirt, which for Rochester is kind of the uniform. Folks see me as a guy, and it's not so dressy that it's intimidating. It's not so casual that it looks like I don't know what I'm doing. But dress is actually kind of important. Think about life as theater and stage, and dress appropriately. Identify an appropriate location for the interview. Now, I like to do the interview someplace outside the room, not in the room with a roommate, potentially a community room, someplace quiet. They may have a place in the facility. Now, it may be that the individual doesn't feel comfortable doing that right away. So maybe at the first interview you're doing it and the person wants to stay in their room. I would encourage you to look at the transition process, and maybe you start in their room, but move to the community room as the process continues, and then eventually get them to come to your center and move out of the facility. So think about that sort of arc in terms of where you're meeting, and use the process itself to help acclimate the person to community living. One of the things that's pretty common that we all know, but want to think about, position yourself at eye level so that the person doesn't have to strain to look at you. I remember also you don't want to lord over the individual. I was at a meeting once and completely pissed off the mayor of our city, and he walked around the table and leaned over me and talked down into my face. I had never experienced that before. It was very surprising. It was meant to be intimidating, and in a way it was. You don't want to do that to folks you're working with. So casually, eye level, so they're comfortable and don't have to strain to look at you. slide 29. We talked a bit about taking notes. Take only essential notes. And, if you can, I have seen people, one woman in particular, I was amazed. She could take notes. I watched her. She took notes without ever looking at the piece of paper. I will never be able to do that. But, she took what she needed to remember what was going on. If you're concerned about looking up your questions or taking notes, letting the person know that, maybe they said something that's really important and you want to make sure you get that, you can say, that was really important. I'm going to write this down so that it becomes a part of the interview process and it's not something that, you're taking secret notes. It lets them have a sense of what you're doing. Respect the person's personal space and equipment. It may be a nursing facility room, but it is their home. I think that, at least for now, so when you go into someone's home, you treat it with respect. Try to do the same thing in this case, please. The person's equipment, obviously, a lot of the typical rules apply. Don't just start futzing with their equipment because it's part of their body, essentially. Treat it with respect. Interview the person alone. So when you're starting out this process, just talk with the individual. Now, people who are paying attention during the first webinar are thinking, wait a second, he said involve the nursing facility from the very beginning. What the hell? This doesn't make sense to me. Okay, I'll clarify. I want you to involve the nursing facility, but you don't necessarily have to include them in everything. So letting them know that you're coming in and meeting with someone with the person's permission, that's fine. They don't necessarily have to be sitting there the entire time. So you may actually do something where, you schedule for them to come and say hi, you chat a little bit about what you're doing. They may be involved in some of the process around explaining what you do and all of that, which allows them to hear what you're talking about. But then, they will have other work to do. Let them go on their way, and then you can have some of these more intimate conversations and build a rapport with the individual. Listen and don't interrupt. Now, on the webinar, there's absolutely no way to interrupt me, so this works for you all here, I guess. But in the real world, you actually can interrupt people and try to finish their answer for them. That you want to give the person the space and the time to tell their story. It's really important. It's important to building rapport. They may include important details in how they tell their story that can help inform the process. So make sure you give them enough time to do that. On slide 30, don't make promises you can't keep. I have almost never said, I promise I will get you out of here. Now, I will admit I have said this a couple of times for people who are very close to me personally. And if I was, and this is not very professional, I will admit this, but if I was pushed to it, I would have just taken them out and taken them home because that's how close. These were close personal friends who were stuck in facilities. It's important, though, that when we're working with folks, that we don't overpromise, or that we don't say we're going to do something and not follow through. That undercuts the relationship and essentially says maybe these people aren't actually going to follow through, and it affects their commitment to the process, and they don't think that this is actually going to happen. What builds their expectation that this can work, that builds their commitment to the process, is when you say you're going to do something and you follow through and do it. They see that you're reliable, you're building a sense of trust with them. That's a really critical piece. Ask about social and community connections. Again, we talked about that. It's really important to talk about what connections they have out in the community. And to build those, and then schedule the next appointment before you leave. I think one of the things that gives people, if you leave the appointment and you say, "See you around," the person doesn't know when that could be. That could be 6 months from now, a year from now. They don't know. Ask the person when they want to meet again. Schedule the time. It builds an expectation with the person that they know when you're coming back. All right, moving on to slide 31. We can open this up again for questions and answers.
Hi, it is more of a comment than a question, and it relates back to the first question and answer session. I'm in California, and our transitions program is being funded by Money Follows the Person, federal money, and this particular program only helps people on Medi-Cal, which is California's name for Medicaid, transition out of skilled nursing facilities and other institutions. And I just wanted to point out that under this program's rules, an assisted living facility, often referred to as a board and care center, doesn't count as an institution. It counts as a community living situation. So we wouldn't be able to help somebody in an assisted living facility leave because under these definitions, they're already in the community. And similarly, if someone in a skilled nursing facility were to leave and transfer to an assisted living facility, then we would no longer be able to serve that individual through this Money Follows the Person program. So just a comment.
Okay, well, thanks. And I think that that's one of the things that more globally we tried to do within our center. There are some particular programs that may provide certain types of support, but then we have our IL funds and other staff who may be able to do that. If where you're at is limited with those funds, there may be another resource that is a little more flexible that could assist some of the folks in assisted living and moving to a different level. I think one of the limits that we actually do put on, and thank you for raising the point, is that we don't work with people from moving from one nursing facility to another. That I think for us, in terms of our resources, our focus is moving people from the institution to the community.
Okay.
And when I say moving from the institution to the community, although we work with people transitioning from assisted living into the community, we have definitely assisted people moving from the nursing facility into assisted living as well, because, again, it's the individual's choice. All right.
Bruce, when you were talking about needing to divulge information and be open and honest with people, when we're in that process of getting to know the person and everything, and they happen to divulge to us that they are a sex offender, what is your suggestion there? I mean, because here we are bringing this person back out into the community, and are we then responsible or what?
Okay, well, we work with people who are convicted sex offenders. Actually, we have transitioned folks from nursing facilities who were convicted. I think the issue for us is I would ask, do you see, depending on if they're convicted, are they under parole? Do they have, the things that I'm concerned about are, do they have mandatory meetings that they have to go to? Do they have meetings with their parole officer? Those are going to have implications for the transportation piece. But if they are not mandated by the court to be in the nursing facility, they're not mandated to be there. We've made it and again, I think that this goes into sort of the criminal history piece. I have to say, I want to praise you that the person felt safe to share the information about their criminal background with you. So you're clearly doing something right there. The person isn't mandated to be in the nursing facility, and depending on what the conviction is, they may be able to offend potentially even more easily in a nursing facility than out in the community. So it really, for us, hasn't weighed into the equation of whether we assist people or not. I know that there are folks out there. I don't tend to filter on those kinds of things. There isn't, if you're locked up by court, you're in jail. And you can't leave on, prison. You can't leave until your date's out. And we even work with them in terms of, we've had folks who are in the process of transitioning out of prison who need to find housing and get set up in the community. So that's one of the, we see that as something that's important for our center to do.
Okay, thank you.
I think the underlying question is, do you have a liability there? And really, you're providing the same service that you provide to anyone. You're not discriminating on the basis of a criminal conviction. And I think that you work with the individuals who identify, for us, we've worked with folks who have been convicted, and, we've helped them sort of navigate. So what's the plan to avoid, reincarceration? and have that conversation. And there have been some real interesting things that people have come up with. And that similarly applies to, alcohol use or drug use. Our center isn't going to filter you out on those criteria because there are lots of people who use drugs and drink out in the community as well. If you need services and supports linked to that, I think that that's something to consider. We've had folks who, were charted as alcoholic, who had issues with alcohol, and I guess the guy was seen drinking a beer out in the community, and my staff person who worked with him was very concerned and came to me and said he was drinking a beer. I said, thank you. I appreciate knowing that, I guess. I don't see what this has to do with anything. It's not breaking the law. It's not a problem. If you see him, you can say, hey, I ran into you, and it opened the conversation up, but it's not something we're going to filter people out from.
Right. And then I have a part 2 question, if you don't mind.
Sure.
One of the struggles we're having here in New Mexico is people that are entering into the nursing homes due to Alzheimer's or dementia, and then we're not able to get them out because they throw the red flag of being a safe discharge. Do you have suggestions there?
Okay, and here, it's a great part 2 question because it raises the question of who is responsible. And one of the things that sometimes people are concerned, well, the nursing facility, in some cases the hospital, they're just throwing up barriers. Well, in fact, they have some responsibilities around discharge as well. They're not supposed to be doing an unsafe discharge. I think we saw a very similar trend here in New York, where that was an issue. I think some of the concern that we had was that the service systems weren't set up to effectively deal with people who had dementia. So our personal care program was limited to physical assistance, hands-on activities of daily living, and completely disregarded instrumental activities of daily living that might be needed by someone with dementia. We didn't have a waiver that met people's needs. That's when the transition folks informed our systems advocacy folks, and we worked to develop a funding stream for services that would do that. And we raised the issue with our state saying, look, here's a group of people who are unserved, who cannot be served in the most integrated setting because your policies prevent them from getting services and supports in the most integrated setting. That was a long-term process, but we were eventually successful. So I think that that's sort of where the services that you provide can inform the advocacy. The other piece that you want to look at is, and we'll talk a bit about this in the next webinar, but that whole issue of what is safe and safety and who's responsible and how do we address those needs. That'll be more in the service planning piece. And if I don't cover it satisfactorily, please bring it up then too.
Okay. Thank you, Bruce.
This is Kara Vandermeer from Arise. I transfer people from nursing homes to the community. Both the nursing homes and aid services require people to have friends and family as backup. A lot of people have no one for the role. What are your suggestions for that?
So in this case, we're talking about the nursing facility or a home care agency saying that they need to have family members as backup or they're not going to serve the individual.
Yes.
In New York, you're just 60 miles away from me. So it's nice to talk to you, Kara. Yeah, nice. You too. In New York, I know specifically that there is, for certified home health services, a list of 6 criteria that are safety. I can share those with you, but one of the things, you only have to meet one of the criteria. The information is actually printed on the back of the intake form for the home care agencies. There are 6 criteria. One of them is, can you call for help? Or do you have another one is, do you have a PERS? So either of those would mean that the individual is safe. Now, we have had to do sometimes what they'll say is the agency is concerned that they're not going to be always able to provide assistance. We know that in our community, sometimes the no-fill, no-show rate is as high as 40%. we're very clear with folks, with the home care agency, that that's an unacceptable problem with quality of service. It's not actually a safety issue. So, we've sort of clarified and negotiated with the home care folks saying, okay, we understand in the event of, a declared state of emergency, like an ice storm here in New York, there may be a problem. In that case, our center has agreed to provide backup for the individual. We've actually done that. I have to say that worked great. First ice storm that came, we were really busy. But even in that case, what happened was the agency would call and say, I don't have an attendant who can get to this person. What do you want to do? And one of the solutions that we said was, well, this individual lives in a high-rise with a whole lot of other people. We know there are attendants in the building. And I just called someone else who I knew who received services from here. I said, do you know who has an attendant in the building? He got back to me within 10 minutes and said, there's an attendant on the 4th floor. She works with this agency. And I called the home care agency up and said, there's an attendant on this floor. She works with this agency. You can arrange to have that done. And sort of coordinated that during an emergency. I don't want to just act as if I am not taking emergencies seriously. We take them extraordinarily seriously. You need to have backup plans. So how are you going to get your needs met? But that should not be a reason the person not having a family member living with the individual should not require the individual to stay in a nursing facility. And I'm happy to share some of the specifics about New York with you all, because I know that this is an issue, and you live in a particularly hideous part of our state around these kinds of things.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I've clicked over to slide 32 here, where, again, Bruce has been generous enough to offer his contact information. So if it's a content question, you're welcome to get to him directly as well. I'm going to click to the evaluation page, and just like on Tuesday, this is a live link. If you're on the webinar, you can click right on this. If not, you can go to the training page that I gave out earlier that's in your confirmation. Please let us know what you thought. Thanks so much again, Bruce. Thanks to all of you for being with us, and we'll talk to you again on